Before the myth of the werewolf became a tale of midnight howls and silver bullets, it was something older, far older, woven into the primal fabric of what it meant to be human. It was a whisper in the wind outside the cave, a shiver along the spine when something unseen moved through the trees, a flicker at the edge of firelight, reminding early man that he was never alone in the dark. The werewolf, half human, half beast, isn't just a monster of folklore. It's a mirror. It reflects the ancient and enduring fear that something wild still lives within us, and that it might one day take over. The earliest humans lived in close contact with predators. To survive, they had to understand them, study their habits, mimic their strategies, even respect their power. Among these predators, none loomed larger in the ancient imagination than the wolf. Intelligent, fast, social, loyal, and deadly, the wolf symbolized both the terror and the majesty of the wild. To be stalked by wolves was to face death. To hunt with their cunning was to live another day. But there was something else, something deeper. In ancient cave paintings, like those found in Chauvet, France, some over 30,000 years old, animals are depicted not just as prey but as partners, spirits, and sometimes something more. In some images, human and beast are fused, a man with antlers, a figure dancing in an animal's skin, hybrid creatures straddling the boundary between human and non-human. Many archaeologists interpret these as evidence of early shamanism, the belief that spiritual leaders could transcend the human form, become animals in vision or ritual, and speak to the hidden forces of nature. The concept of shapeshifting wasn't entertainment, it was cosmology. Becoming a beast was a sacred rite, not a curse. Shamans in Siberia, the Arctic, and parts of Central Asia were said to enter trance states, their souls leaving their bodies and roaming as wolves or bears. The transformation was symbolic, spiritual, empowering, not yet monstrous. Over time, the line between spiritual metaphor and literal belief began to blur. In ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, legends emerged that hinted at darker transformations. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known pieces of literature, the goddess Ishtar tells of turning a former lover into a wolf. The act is swift, brutal, and permanent, a divine punishment. The man, once beloved, becomes hunted by his own kind. Here, shapeshifting becomes moral commentary. To be made a wolf is to be cast out, to become the thing society fears. And in this, something shifts. In ancient Greece, that shift becomes a seismic rupture. According to legend, there was once a king in Arcadia named Lycaon. He was wealthy, proud, and cruel. To test the gods, or perhaps mock them, he served Zeus a meal made from the flesh of a murdered child. Enraged, Zeus struck him down with thunder and transformed him into a wolf. Lycaon's punishment was to become what he was in spirit: savage, deceitful, beyond redemption. Ovid's Metamorphoses immortalized the tale, and the name Lycaon became the root of the term lycanthropy, from the Greek lykos, wolf, and anthropos, man. It's a story of transformation, yes, but also of justice. The beast is not a tragic victim. It is a reflection of inner depravity. The man who acts like a wolf must become one. From there, the legend traveled far and wide. In the Nordic world, warriors known as Ulfhednar, wolfskin fighters, fought in frenzied, trance-like states, believing they channeled the power of wolves. Unlike the berserkers, who wore bear pelts, the Ulfhednar were said to be more cunning, more controlled, more loyal to their battle brothers. In some sagas, they were revered, in others, feared. Always, they walked the line between man and monster. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, noted that the Nuri tribe of Scythia transformed into wolves once a year. He didn't claim to believe it, but he recorded it nonetheless, giving the story permanence. Whether symbolic or literal, the transformation became part of the historical record. The Romans, for their part, absorbed and catalogued these tales. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, recounts stories of men who, through magical rites, became wolves and lived among the wild for years before returning to human form. One such tale told of a man who left his clothes in a sacred grove, became a wolf for 9 years, and then returned, older, haunted, unchanged. These were not stories meant to scare children. They were whispered by firelight, passed between soldiers, slaves, and senators alike. The idea that man could become beast was at once horrifying and seductive. But something darker was coming. As Christianity spread across the Roman world, and beyond, it brought with it a new vision of nature, one in which the wild was not sacred but fallen, not mystical but corrupt. Wolves, once respected, were now symbols of Satan. To wear the skin of a wolf was to flirt with sin, to become one. Heresy don't early church texts mention lycanthropy as evidence of demonic possession. Saint Augustine, in The City of God, acknowledges that pagans believed in such transformations, though he dismissed them as illusions or deceptions of the devil. The line between folklore and theology began to dissolve. Belief became blasphemy. By the early medieval period, shapeshifting was no longer a gift from the gods or a vision quest. It was a curse, a punishment, or the result of unholy magic. And where there is fear, there is fire. Across the forests and villages of Europe, tales of werewolves grew sharper, more violent, and more morally charged. No longer spiritual figures, they became creatures of the night, agents of chaos, destroyers of livestock, abductors of children. And worst of all, they looked like ordinary men by day. The fear was not just of the beast, but of the neighbor who might become one. Whispers turned to accusations. Accusations turned to confessions, often under torture. Confessions led to burnings, hangings, and trials that would echo the witch hunts of the coming centuries. Some of these cases were undoubtedly fabrications, others deeply believed. And as the medieval world tightened its grip on belief and punished those who strayed beyond its sanctioned truths, the legends did not fade, they multiplied. In shadowed villages, on long winter nights, stories spread, not only of beasts that stalked the forests, but of men who became them. And somewhere between prayer and torchlight, the wolf walked upright once more. By the late Middle Ages, belief in werewolves was no longer limited to whispered stories or pagan lore. It had hardened into a judicial reality. Across Europe, particularly in regions on the edge of civilization where superstition clung tighter than law, men and women were tried, convicted, and executed for the crime of becoming beasts. What had once been ritual had become heresy. What had once been sacred had been recast as demonic. The line between witch and werewolf, between heretic and monster, was dissolving. And nowhere was this transformation more horrifyingly clear than in the chilling records of the witch hunts between the 15th and 17th centuries. The fear was no longer just spiritual, it was institutional. In 1521, in Poligny, France, 2 men, Pierre Burgot and Michel Verdun, were arrested on charges of lycanthropy. Under torture, they confessed to a tale that even the inquisitors found shocking. Verdun claimed that he had initiated Burgot into a pact with the devil. At a gathering of witches, they were given a magical ointment that, when applied to their skin, allowed them to turn into wolves. In their lupine forms, they claimed to have hunted in the forests, killed animals, and even devoured children. Their punishment was swift and gruesome. They were burned at the stake. What is most striking is not just the confession, but the consistency of such accounts. Over and over, during this period, individuals accused of lycanthropy described a similar pattern, a pact with a dark force, a salve or potion or belt that initiated the transformation, followed by violent acts committed while in beast form. Whether these confessions were real, imagined, or extracted under the unbearable weight of torture, they reflected a society in which the idea of man turning into wolf was not just possible, it was punishable by death. Consider the case of Gilles Garnier, known as the Werewolf of Dole. In 1573, Garnier was a reclusive man living near the woods of France. When children began disappearing from nearby villages, suspicion turned toward the hermit. Once arrested, Garnier confessed to having been given an ointment by a spirit that allowed him to turn into a wolf. In his transformed state, he admitted to attacking, killing, and partially eating several children. Whether he believed this to be true, or whether he fabricated it to match the expectations of his inquisitors, is unclear. What is certain is that he too was burned alive. What made these accusations more chilling was the blurring of physical evidence and folklore. In Garnier's case, villagers testified that they had seen a beast near the attacks, and some claimed to have witnessed a man turning back into a human form. The lines between witness testimony and mythological projection were paper-thin. In a world with no forensic science, where faith often held more weight than fact, the idea that a man could transform into a beast was as real as hunger, plague, or war. The phenomenon was not limited to France. In Germany, between 1589 and 1590, perhaps the most notorious werewolf trial in history took place, that of Peter Stump, also spelled Stubber, a wealthy farmer from the region of Bedburg. The accounts are blood-curdling. Stump was accused of practicing black magic since the age of 12. He confessed, after prolonged torture, to using a magical girdle given to him by the devil to turn into a wolf. In this form, he admitted to murdering and eating 14 children, 2 pregnant women, and even his own son. He also confessed to incest and cannibalism. The execution was barbaric, even by 16th century standards. Stump was strapped to a breaking wheel, his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, his limbs shattered with a wooden mallet, and finally decapitated. His head was placed on a pike alongside the body of a wolf as a warning. But the question lingers: was Peter Stump a madman, a murderer, or a scapegoat in a time of mass hysteria? The truth likely lies somewhere between psychology and fear. The early modern period was a time of chaos in Europe. Wars, famine, plague, and religious conflict had destabilized communities. In such times, monsters are not only easy to believe in, they are necessary. They offer simple explanations for complicated pain. What we see in the records of werewolf trials is a tragic pattern. Outsiders, the mentally ill, the impoverished, or those who lived close to the edge of civilization were more likely to be accused. Their isolation, their difference, and often their inability to defend themselves made them perfect targets. Yet not all beliefs in werewolves were malevolent. In parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, there existed a parallel tradition where shapeshifting was not always evil, but protective. In Serbia, the vukodlak was a feared figure, but also a complex one. The term is often translated as werewolf, but it carried multiple meanings. Sometimes it was synonymous with vampire or ghost. Other times it referred to warriors or shamans who could battle evil spirits. The line between myth and magic, protector and predator, was fluid. In Livonia, present-day Latvia and Estonia, the story of Tis of Kaltenbrunn stands out as a powerful counterpoint. In 1692, Tis, an elderly man, was brought before a court and accused of witchcraft, but he confessed not to being a servant of the devil, but to being a good werewolf. According to Tis, he and others like him turned into wolves to descend into hell and fight witches and demons to protect the harvest. He called himself a hound of God. The judges were not amused. He was flogged and exiled. Yet the idea lingers. In some corners of the world, the werewolf was not just a monster, but a guardian, a symbol of the wildness that defends, not destroys, a creature of the in-between. What all of these accounts, whether of terror or reverence, share is the understanding that to become a wolf was to cross a boundary between human and animal, between self and other, between civilization and the untamed world, and perhaps between sanity and something darker. The psychological dimension of lycanthropy was not lost on early thinkers. As early as the 2nd century AD, the Greek physician Marcellus of Side wrote of lycanthropos, a condition in which men imagined themselves to be wolves and wandered in graveyards howling. This concept of clinical lycanthropy has since appeared in medical literature throughout the ages, describing individuals who genuinely believe they are transforming into wolves or other animals. In the 20th century, psychiatrists studying these cases noted that the delusion was often accompanied by feelings of guilt, alienation, and repressed rage. The werewolf, in this context, becomes not just a cultural myth, but a psychological release valve, a manifestation of the internal beast. In modern terms, one could argue that the myth persists not because it's ridiculous, but because it's revealing. The werewolf is not a fantasy. It is a projection, a personification of the part of us that remains untamed, that resists the strictures of society, that howls at injustice or instinct. And perhaps most powerfully, it is a myth of transformation, of something irreversible, of a crossing from which one might never return. In a time when transformation was both feared and fetishized, the werewolf was the perfect symbol. It encapsulated everything medieval and early modern society feared: loss of control, loss of identity, and the possibility that evil could wear a human face by day. What began as shamanic union with nature had become a symbol of estrangement, where, once the wolf was a spirit guide, it was now a shadow on the wall. The legend was no longer about becoming something more. It was about becoming less, losing what made one human. And yet, for all the fire and fear, the stories continued. Around hearths, in court records, in whispered warnings to children, the werewolf became folklore, then literature, then symbol. And it would rise again, not in the medieval courts, but in the modern imagination. Because monsters, unlike men, do not die. They evolve. Something changed when the Enlightenment arrived. For centuries, fear had ruled over reason. Tales of werewolves and witches thrived in the twilight space where religion, law, and folklore blurred into one. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe experienced a seismic shift. Science began to challenge superstition. The telescope replaced the crucifix as a tool for truth. And yet, though inquisitions dwindled and public burnings faded into memory, the werewolf did not vanish. It simply retreated into shadow, waiting for a new kind of storyteller. As belief in demons gave way to the pursuit of rational explanations, the werewolf passed from courtroom testimony to the pages of literature and the salons of philosophers. But it did not lose its teeth. Instead, it evolved into something far more symbolic. In 18th century France, medical professionals began studying mental illness more seriously. In this new context, werewolf legends weren't dismissed, they were reclassified. Physicians like Jean Taxil and Johann Weyer wrote extensively on what they called clinical lycanthropy, a delusional disorder in which individuals believed they could transform into wolves. One early case described a man who ran naked through cemeteries, howling at the moon, claiming to hunt and devour corpses. His symptoms were treated not with exorcism, but with confinement and early forms of therapy. Yet for every man of science who sought natural causes, there remained voices whispering older truths. In rural France, the memory of the beast of Gévaudan still stalked the hills. Between 1764 and 1767, a series of brutal attacks terrorized the region of Gévaudan in south-central France. Witnesses described a creature unlike any known animal, larger than a wolf, with reddish fur, a strange odor, and no fear of man. It attacked children, women, even groups of armed peasants. Over 100 deaths were reported. The king himself sent professional hunters. Some claimed to kill it, others said it could not die. The panic was not simply about a predator, it was about something unexplainable. And though the official records listed beast, the local stories said something more. Some whispered of a sorcerer, a skinwalker, a creature that could not be slain because it was no beast at all, but a man in disguise. It was the last werewolf panic of pre-revolutionary France. and it would be remembered. Meanwhile, in the colder landscapes of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, werewolf lore continued to evolve in its own direction. In Slavic countries, the line between werewolf and vampire blurred. The Volkodlak, and similar figures shifted identities depending on the region. Sometimes a man became a wolf after death. Sometimes the werewolf drank blood. Sometimes it returned to its human form during the day, indistinguishable from its neighbors. These were not Hollywood monsters. These were shapeshifters of fear and folklore, blending disease, death, and otherness into a single narrative body. And still, the myth was not static. In Norse legends, for instance, the story of Sigmund and Sinfjotli offers an early literary example of conscious werewolf transformation. In the Volsunga saga, the two men discover enchanted wolf pelts that, once worn, transform the bearer into a wolf for 10 days. They hunt, kill, and eventually fight one another. When the pelts are removed, they regain human form. Unlike the tortured Confessions of the Witch Trial era, this tale does not frame the transformation as evil. It is powerful, dangerous, but not cursed. The wolf form grants freedom, strength, even honor. Yet it also exposes darker instincts, rage, bloodlust, disconnection from society. The theme, as ever, is duality. This duality continued to haunt the imagination as werewolf tales moved from fireside to fiction. In 1831, George W. M. Reynolds published Wagner the Werewolf, one of the first English-language novels to feature a werewolf protagonist. The story follows a German peasant who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for youth and vitality, only to be cursed to become a wolf at night. It's a tale thick with Gothic atmosphere, moral reckoning, and the ever-present tension between desire and damnation. A generation later, in 1865, French author Guy Endore penned The Werewolf of Paris, a novel now considered the werewolf equivalent of Dracula. Set during the Franco-Prussian War, it centers around Bertrand Caillet, a man born under sinister circumstances and plagued by uncontrollable urges. The novel blends horror, psychology, and history, painting lycanthropy as both a personal and societal disease. Caillet's transformations mirror the chaos of war and the breakdown of human morality in times of violence. The beast within, it suggests, is always waiting. By the 19th century, the werewolf had become a literary archetype, part monster, part metaphor. Authors no longer needed to believe in literal transformations. They understood the deeper meaning, that the werewolf represented the animal in man, the hidden rage, the forbidden desire. It was Freud before Freud. But even as literature explored the metaphor, local folklore continued to insist on the literal. In parts of rural Germany, the Netherlands, and even England, stories persisted of men seen changing shapes, of wolves walking on two legs, of unexplained killings under full moons. Science had risen, yes, but the shadows had not disappeared. And then came the 20th century cinema, that most modern of storytelling tools, found the werewolf waiting. In 1913, The Werewolf, a Canadian silent film now sadly lost to history, became the first known movie about lycanthropy. It told the story of a Native American woman who transforms into a wolf to avenge the death of her lover. Though the film is gone, its influence lingers. But it was in 1941, with Universal Studios' release of The Wolfman, that the werewolf entered the modern mythos in full form. Starring Lon Chaney Jr., The Wolfman established much of the canon we now associate with werewolves: the full moon triggering transformation, the bite as the method of infection, and silver as the only effective weapon. These were not ancient details. They were Hollywood inventions, chosen for drama and consistency. And yet, they became part of the collective memory. The film's real power, however, lay in its emotional tone. Larry Talbot, the protagonist, is not evil. He is cursed, a victim of fate, torn between his love for others and the monster he cannot control. The film is dripping with fog and fatalism, echoing the trauma of a world at war, the fear of losing control. the sense that something inside us might awaken and destroy the things we love. It was the werewolf for the atomic age. From that point on, the werewolf was no longer just folklore. It was genre. It moved through horror and fantasy, satire and science fiction. It became a figure of adolescence, rage, repression, addiction, and identity crisis. But for all its modern transformations, one thing never changed. The werewolf remained a story about boundaries between man and beast, between reason and madness, between civilization and the forest, and perhaps between who we think we are and what we might become. In folklore, these boundaries were crossed in darkness. In literature, they were explored through metaphor. In film, they were exploded on screen. But in all cases, the werewolf legend endured because it asked a timeless question. What happens when the human self is not strong enough to hold back what lurks beneath? By the time the world reached the late 20th century, the werewolf was no longer confined to ancient fears or medieval confessions. It had become something more, something flexible. The creature now wore many masks: victim, monster, metaphor, even anti-hero. The story had moved from forest to city, from torchlit hunts to psychological thrillers. But at its core, the werewolf continued to haunt because it spoke a truth we were never quite ready to face: that the line between man and beast is thinner than we pretend. With the rise of psychology and mass media, storytellers reimagined the werewolf as a vehicle to explore identity, rage, repression, and transformation. Gone was the purely folkloric figure cursed by magic or punished by gods. In its place rose a new narrative: the human being at war with his own nature. In 1981, two landmark films premiered just months apart: The Howling and An American Werewolf in London. Both revolutionized the visual language of werewolf mythology. No longer did a man simply slump behind a bush and emerge snarling. Now, transformation was agony. Bones cracking, muscles contorting, skin splitting, hair sprouting. The monster didn't arrive gently, it tore its way out. The change was no longer metaphorical. It was body horror. It was evolution made monstrous. But, even amid the grotesque visuals, a deeper story persisted. In An American Werewolf in London, the main character, David, is a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Bitten by a creature in the foggy English moors, he wakes up in a hospital and begins to question his sanity. When the full moon rises, he transforms and kills without memory. The horror lies not just in what he becomes, but in his awareness of it. He knows he is dangerous. He knows he will kill, and he cannot stop it. It's a narrative built on guilt. The wolf is not a metaphor for external danger. It is the danger within. And in this way, the werewolf becomes something new, a symbol of psychological disintegration. That shift was not accidental. The 20th century had seen the rise of modern warfare, genocide, totalitarianism, and mass trauma. Millions of people had watched seemingly ordinary men commit atrocities. The question of how a human being becomes a monster was no longer theoretical. It was historical. And the werewolf myth, flexible, ancient, ever symbolic, offered a language to speak the unspeakable. What do you call the moment when a man loses control and commits violence? When his eyes glaze over, his pulse rises, and something primal takes over. You call it a transformation. You call it the wolf. In the decades that followed, werewolves continued to adapt. They appeared in novels, television, video games, and comics, each iteration adjusting to new cultural fears and desires. In some stories, they were still cursed. In others, they were born that way. Some were tragic, others triumphant. The werewolf became an identity to be inherited, chosen, or rejected. And in this shift, the werewolf became something it had never been before: romantic. The 2000s brought a new genre of supernatural storytelling, urban fantasy, and paranormal romance. Werewolves, once symbols of damnation, became objects of longing. Their danger made them attractive, their strength seductive. In series like Twilight, The Vampire Diaries, and Teen Wolf, werewolves were brooding, beautiful, conflicted. They weren't hunting villagers. They were trying to pass chemistry class or protect their pack. They wrestled not with villagers, but with feelings. They longed for connection, not blood. This softening wasn't just marketing, it was cultural evolution. In a time when identity politics, emotional intelligence, and self-discovery were rising themes, the werewolf became a canvas for transformation on multiple levels. It spoke to puberty, gender, trauma, sexuality. In some stories, the bite was no longer a curse. It was a metaphor for awakening, a forced re-evaluation of one's identity. The wolf became a rite of passage, and yet, the darkness never fully left. Even in the most sanitized adaptations, the questions still lingered. What happens when you lose control? When instinct overrides morality? When you are driven not by thought, but by impulse? It's no coincidence that the full moon, the classic trigger for transformation, is also a symbol of lunacy, of cycles, of tides and blood and madness. The werewolf is not just an animal, it is timing, it is inevitability, but perhaps most powerfully, it is duality. Because to understand the power of the werewolf myth, one must return to its most enduring characteristic. It is not about the beast, it is about the transformation, about what happens in between, about the crack between skin and fur, between scream and howl. This is why werewolf stories rarely end happily, because the conflict is not external, it is internal. The enemy is not the world, it is the self, and in this, the werewolf speaks to something universal. Everyone wears a mask, everyone hides something. Everyone feels the pull of emotion over logic, of hunger over restraint. The werewolf externalizes that struggle, gives it teeth and claws. It forces us to ask, if I were freed from consequence, from reason, from shame, what would I become? This question echoes not just in fiction but in psychology, philosophy, even politics. Thinkers like Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the repressed, denied parts of the psyche that, if ignored, grow more dangerous. The shadow is not evil. It is unintegrated, unconscious. And left unchecked, it emerges in destructive ways. The werewolf is the shadow made flesh. In the modern age, where self-control is prized and deviance punished, the idea of giving in to instinct, of howling, running, tearing away the facade, is terrifying and exhilarating, which is why the myth survives. It survives because it is not just a story, it is a truth, one that changes shape with every generation. In one century, the werewolf is a cursed sinner. In another, a misunderstood loner. In one decade, he's the monster in the woods. In another, the boyfriend next door. But in all cases, he is the outsider, the in-between, the man on the brink. Even in cultures where the Western-style werewolf is not native, parallel myths exist. In Japan, the kitsune, a fox spirit, can shapeshift and deceive, sometimes with noble, sometimes malevolent intentions. In Africa, the Buddha, or hyena man, walks at night. In South America, tales of the lobisomne echo the themes of transformation, solitude, and taboo. The point is not that the wolf is universal, it's that the transformation is. Every culture has a myth of becoming, of crossing a line, of what lies on the other side of control. And this is why, even in an age of science, surveillance, and social media, the werewolf still stalks our dreams. It is the story we whisper to ourselves in the dark, that no matter how clean we look, how controlled we act, how well we blend into the modern world, something old still lives beneath the skin. Waiting. There is something eternal about the forest. Long before cities were built of glass and steel, long before maps were complete, the forest represented both life and terror. It was where one went to gather food, to hunt, to find solitude, or to disappear. It was a place without walls or borders, where rules changed and shadows deepened. And it is within these forests, again and again, that the werewolf returns. The geography of the legend is no accident. In nearly every culture that tells tales of shapeshifters, the wilderness is the stage upon which the transformation unfolds. Not the town square, not the home, but the woods, the untamed. In medieval Europe, forests stretched for hundreds of miles, dark and impenetrable. Most people never travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace. The forest was not simply landscape. It was otherworldly. It was the unknown, and the unknown by nature must be filled with beasts, with spirits, with men who become wolves. French peasants spoke of the loup-garou, a creature both man and wolf who prowled the edges of farmland and villages. The loup-garou was rarely a stranger. More often, he was someone local, a farmer, a miller, someone touched by sin or cursed by a witch. Someone who, for reasons beyond his control, changed when the moon rose. His crime wasn't just murder, it was transgression. He had crossed a line, and the community responded with fear, with accusation, sometimes with fire. In the Germanic world, the word werewolf literally meant man-wolf. It wasn't poetic, it was literal. And like many folklore figures, the werewolf was used to explain the unexplainable. A child found dead in the woods, a livestock mutilation, a series of strange howls at night. Blame the werewolf. But it wasn't always a tale of violence. Sometimes it was a story of sorrow. In the Breton ballads of France, there are stories of men who become wolves and weep beneath the trees, unable to return to their families. They are not evil, only cursed. Victims of jealousy, of betrayal, of love gone wrong. In these versions, the werewolf is a figure of loneliness, one who walks among wolves but remembers what it was to be human. It is this sadness that gives the legend its staying power. Fear alone does not preserve a story. There must be pathos. There must be something in the beast that reflects back not just our nightmares, but our regrets. This emotional dimension appears again and again. In Ireland and Scotland, tales of feolaid or wolvers, wolf-like creatures, sometimes depict them as guardians of children or lost travellers. In these legends, the wolf-man is not a monster, but a mysterious protector. He remains apart from society, misunderstood and feared, but ultimately noble. He does not attack without cause. He does not kill without reason. In such stories, the transformation is not a punishment. It is a burden. One that grants power, yes, but at the cost of belonging. The werewolf becomes a tragic figure, a metaphor for anyone who lives between worlds. And perhaps this is the heart of the myth: liminality. The werewolf is not just a hybrid of man and beast. He is the inhabitant of thresholds, of dusk rather than day or night, of borderlands, not cities or wilderness, of identity that cannot be fixed. He is not one or the other, he is both, and in being both, he is neither. This in-between state makes him dangerous, but also illuminating. It is through the werewolf that storytellers explore questions society cannot otherwise ask. What does it mean to lose control? What is the price of power? Can someone be both good and monstrous? Can a soul be split in two? And so, the myth is retold. In poetry, the werewolf is longing. In folklore, he is warning. In horror, he is vengeance. In fantasy, he is transformation. But in every form, he represents that which cannot be comfortably contained. As civilization advanced, the forest was cut down, paved over, mapped and categorized. But the werewolf did not vanish. He followed us into our cities, into our homes, into our dreams. Modern horror often takes place in the suburbs, in basements, in bedrooms. The monster no longer waits in the woods. It lives next door. It rides the train. It sits behind you at work. And when it transforms, the horror is not that it is alien, but that it is familiar. Because the modern werewolf is not just a creature of fur and fang. It is a co-worker with rage issues, a teenager with overwhelming emotions, a soldier with PTSD, a parent pushed to the brink, a lover with something to hide. The transformation may not be literal, but it is real. It manifests in addiction, in violence, in breakdown. And that is why the legend still matters. The werewolf, more than any other mythical creature, is about self-control. Vampires are about desire. Ghosts are about memory. Zombies are about society. But werewolves, they are about the self. The war inside the ribcage. The voice you don't want to hear when the room goes silent. The moment when you realize you are capable of things you never imagined. Not because you are evil, but because you are human. This is the paradox of the werewolf. He is both a warning and a mirror, a projection of what we fear and what we are, and, in that tension, storytellers continue to find power. In graphic novels like fables, werewolves are detectives caught between magic and morality. In fantasy series, they are part of chosen families, tribes of the outcast and misunderstood. In darker tales, they are still hunted, still feared, but always central, always evolving. And it is not just men. The myth has broadened. Modern werewolf stories increasingly center on women, on queer identities, on those who historically have not been permitted to lose control. In these stories, the transformation is not just rage, it is freedom. The wolf is not a curse. It is a body that does not apologize, a howl that demands to be heard. This reclamation is not accidental. It reflects a broader cultural truth, that the werewolf, like all myths, is a tool. And tools can be reshaped. Used wisely, the werewolf tells us that no one is truly monstrous until they are denied their voice. Used carelessly, it reminds us that fear will always find a face to blame. The myth endures because it grows, because every generation finds something in it that speaks to the moment. A war, a plague, a movement, a silence, and always a transformation. Because the wolf does not disappear. It waits, in the bones, in the blood, in the stories passed down, by firelight or flickering screens, waiting for the moment when we stop pretending to be whole and remember what it is to be split. The myths we inherit are not just stories, they are survival tools. They offer maps of meaning, blueprints for behavior, warnings and wonders from those who came before. They are the language of instinct written in metaphor. And among these, the werewolf stands as one of the most persistent, not because it is the most terrifying, but because it speaks to something elemental, the fear of becoming something we can no longer control. In ancient times, this fear was dressed in ritual. In the practices of tribal societies, transformation was not always feared, it was revered. Shamans wore animal pelts not to mock the beast, but to embody it. To cross the line into the spirit world required shedding human form, if only symbolically. Becoming animal was the bridge to the divine. But with the rise of organized religion and state power, the meaning of transformation changed. What was once a sacred act became a transgression, and the wolf, once a symbol of endurance, community, and strength, became the other, the danger, the damned. This narrative did not arise by accident. For rulers, both secular and spiritual, control depended on boundaries. The line between man and beast, citizen and criminal, sacred and profane, these were not just philosophical distinctions, they were tools of governance. To blur them was to threaten the very order of things. So, the werewolf became a scapegoat, quite literally, a way of explaining deviation, a story that allowed communities to preserve their sense of moral purity while projecting chaos onto someone else, a madman, a heretic, a stranger. He was what happened when the rules were broken. But, over time, the myth began to mutate, not disappear, mutate. Because even as the institutions of control strengthened, so too did the human need to imagine what it might be like to break free, to become wild, to run without consequence, to rage without apology. The Enlightenment and its emphasis on reason could not kill the werewolf, nor could the rise of science, because science, for all its instruments, cannot measure the heat of shame, the pulse of guilt, the tremor of desire. It was Sigmund Freud who, perhaps unwittingly, breathed new life into the myth. His work on the unconscious mind, on repressed instincts and hidden drives, read like a psychological retelling of the werewolf story. Beneath the surface of civilization, he argued, lies a seething mass of instincts, sexual, violent, chaotic. In his framework, transformation is not supernatural, it is inevitable. Carl Jung took this further with his theory of the shadow, the dark, unacknowledged parts of the psyche. The shadow is not evil, it is simply what we hide, and when we deny it too long, it erupts, not as dialogue, but as action, not as reason, but as instinct. The werewolf is the shadow made flesh. This understanding found fertile ground in the 20th century's greatest horrors, in war, in genocide, in political violence that reduced human beings to beasts, and worse. The myth of the werewolf allowed artists and thinkers to explore how ordinary people commit extraordinary acts of savagery. In Primo Levi's writing about the Holocaust, there are echoes of the werewolf, men stripped of identity, transformed by ideology, reduced to hunger and brutality, not because they were monsters, but because they were human. And the myth asked, how close are we to that edge? In cinema, this question was explored again and again. In The Company of Wolves, 1984, director Neil Jordan presents a surreal, dreamlike retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, in which werewolves are metaphors for puberty, sexual awakening, and the danger of innocence. The film blends fairy tale and nightmare, making the transformation into a wolf both terrifying and seductive. In Wolf, 1994, Jack Nicholson plays a man infected by a werewolf bite who gradually discovers that the transformation is not purely negative. He gains confidence, assertiveness, power, but also a growing lack of empathy. The beast within doesn't just attack others, it erodes the self. The message is subtle but clear. What we fear is not the fangs. It's the desire to use them. This nuance is why the myth continues to resonate. The werewolf is not a simple villain. He is the embodiment of complexity, of contradiction. He is strength and shame, loyalty and violence, solitude and community. He lives between roles, between laws, between skins. And because of this, he offers a narrative space where difficult truths can be explored. This is especially evident in contemporary reinterpretations. In LGBTQ+ fiction and film, for instance, the werewolf often symbolizes bodily change, hidden identity, or the fear of exposure. Transformation is no longer just about monstrosity. It's about coming out, being seen, being feared for what one is. In stories about trauma, the wolf is not the enemy, it is the scar. The body that remembers what the mind wants to forget. The transformation becomes the body's way of keeping score. Even in stories of resistance and revolution, the werewolf appears. In dystopian fiction, he is the rebel who refuses domestication, the one who cannot be controlled, the threat not because of what he destroys, but because of what he refuses to become. This adaptability is the werewolf's greatest strength. Unlike the vampire, who often represents seduction, power, and aristocracy, the werewolf is deeply democratic. He can be anyone. He can come from anywhere. His curse is not tied to wealth, lineage, or supernatural seduction. It is tied to pain, to history, to blood. He is, in a sense, the most human of monsters. And perhaps that is why we keep returning to him. Because as much as we fear him, we recognize him. In the friend who snaps under pressure, in the stranger who lashes out in grief, in the face in the mirror, flushed with anger or shame. We recognize the moment before control slips, the moment before the howl. And in that recognition, the myth becomes something more than a story. It becomes a warning or an invitation, depending on who is listening. We often think of transformation as a moment, an event marked by full moons, bitten flesh, or ritual incantations. But real transformation, the kind that lives at the root of myth, is often slow, invisible, internal, a gradual erosion of certainty, a shift in how we see ourselves, or how others see us. The werewolf is not just a creature of folklore, it is a process. And nowhere is that process more clearly dramatized than in the ways werewolves have been used to represent the outsider. Not simply the feared other, but the misunderstood one, the exile, the marked, the marginal. In many early stories, the man who becomes a wolf is not evil. He is cursed, or chosen, or wounded. And once changed, he cannot go back to what he was. His transformation is not just physical, it is social. He is no longer fully human, no longer trusted, no longer safe to be around. Even when he wears a man's face by day, the shadow of the wolf clings to him. He has become other, and that otherness becomes exile. This is the heart of the werewolf's enduring emotional power. Unlike the vampire who seduces, or the zombie who infects en masse, the werewolf isolates. He is often a loner, a drifter, a wanderer outside the town, watching fires from the tree line. He wants to belong, but cannot, not because of hatred, but because of what lives inside him. This has made the werewolf an especially potent figure. In stories about adolescence, the 1980s and 90s saw an explosion of films and novels where lycanthropy was a metaphor for puberty. In Teen Wolf, 1985, a teenage boy discovers that his werewolf heritage activates just as he starts navigating high school, popularity, and romance. At first, the wolf is empowering. He becomes stronger, cooler, more confident. But eventually, it threatens to consume him. He must learn to integrate it rather than be overtaken by it. The story is light-hearted, but the symbolism is clear. The wolf is the rush of hormones, of impulses, of new power with unclear limits. In more serious stories, the metaphor deepens. In Ginger Snaps, 2000, a Canadian cult horror film, the protagonist Ginger begins transforming into a werewolf shortly, after getting her first period. Her body begins to change in grotesque, uncontrollable ways. The film links menstruation, sexual awakening, and lycanthropy with startling bluntness and brilliant honesty. The wolf is not just monstrous, it is biological, feminine, terrifying in its inevitability. These stories don't demonize puberty. They make it mythic. They give it claws and consequence. Because every teenager, in some way, fears they are becoming something unknown. And this fear, this transformation of identity, is not limited to age. It speaks to anyone who has undergone a sudden shift in how the world sees them. The immigrant, the queer youth, the trauma survivor, the person struggling with mental illness. The werewolf becomes a symbol of the internal truth that no longer fits the external world. In some traditions, the transformation is not triggered by the moon, but by emotion, anger, lust, grief. These feelings are not evil, but they are powerful. And when the body changes in response, the result is not just terror, it's exposure. The werewolf becomes a figure of vulnerability, of someone whose mask has cracked. And that vulnerability is key. The best werewolf stories are not about domination. They are about what it costs to hide, to pretend, to suppress. In many tales, the werewolf tries to live a normal life. He avoids people. He builds routines. He chains himself in basements. He warns others to stay away. But the change comes anyway, and, when it does, he loses not just control, but credibility. No one believes what he is, or they believe too much and want him dead. Either way, he loses. This cycle of hiding, fearing, and transforming mirrors the lives of many who live with invisible burdens. It's why the myth survives in modern psychology. The idea of the beast within has become shorthand for trauma responses, dissociation, suppressed rage. In therapy, people sometimes speak of themselves in two voices, the calm one and the one that lashes out, the one that obeys and the one that wants to destroy. The werewolf gives shape to this dichotomy. He allows people to imagine what it feels, like when the rational self fails, when the body acts without permission, when the mind watches in horror from behind the eyes. This is not just fantasy, it is testimony. The werewolf has also been linked to real-world neurological and psychiatric conditions. Clinical lycanthropy, as mentioned earlier, is a rare but documented syndrome in which a person believes they are turning into an animal, most commonly a wolf. In some cases, the belief is so strong that the individual howls, crawls, and even attacks others. It's easy to dismiss this as delusion, but what it reveals is the depth of the myth's roots. The wolf is not just in the culture, it is in the wiring. Anthropologists have noted that in every corner of the world, humans tell stories of transformation, not always into wolves, but into leopards, tigers, hyenas, bears, jaguars. The specifics change with geography. The structure remains the same. The human becomes beast. The rules are broken. The exile begins. In Africa, shapeshifter myths often take the form of were-hyenas or were-leopards. In India, some tribes tell of tiger men, humans who become striped predators under certain rites. In Amazonian tribes, there are stories of jaguar men who walk between the village and the jungle. These stories often serve social functions. They warn against arrogance, against taboo, against breaking communal bonds, but they also explain the inexplicable, a murder with no suspect, a sickness with no cause, a betrayal that makes no sense. The answer? A shapeshifter. This may seem primitive, but the impulse is not. Even in modern times, we still reach for myth to explain pain. Why do good people do terrible things? Why does someone snap? Why do I feel like a stranger in my own body? These are not new questions. And the werewolf offers no answers, only mirrors. And in those mirrors, we see ourselves not as monsters, but as works in progress, as beings in flux, as creatures who, under the right conditions, might change. This is why the werewolf continues to haunt, not because it is evil, but because it is familiar. The transformation it dramatizes is not just physical, it is emotional, psychological, social, existential. It is what happens when identity becomes unstable, when you are no longer sure what you are, when the voice inside you begins to growl. Beneath every werewolf legend lies a landscape of unspoken rules about identity, community, and the price of disobedience. These rules are rarely written, yet they define the lines between myth and morality. To become a wolf, in almost every version of the story, is to step outside those lines, not just to break a rule, but to become what rules are meant to contain. And so, throughout history, the werewolf has often been a scapegoat, a way for communities to project fear outward. When crops failed, when children vanished, when a neighbor acted strangely, there was always someone who could be named, marked, burned. It's no accident that many accused werewolves in the early modern period lived on the margins. Widows, beggars, loners. Those without power were most likely to be called beasts. And, once the accusation was made, evidence became irrelevant. Belief was enough. This mechanism of accusation, projection, and punishment mirrors larger societal dynamics. It's the same pattern seen in witch trials, pogroms, even political purges. The werewolf becomes not a literal figure, but a vessel. Into it, society pours its shame, its grief, its failures, and then, with fire or sword or prison, the vessel is broken, the threat is removed, But the fear remains, because the fear is never really about the beast. It is about the human capacity to become one. This is why werewolf stories, even today, often revolve around secrecy. The character knows something is wrong. They feel it in their bones, their blood. They try to hide it, control it, but eventually it emerges, usually at the worst possible moment. And when it does, they are judged not only for what they've done, but for what they are. The transformation itself becomes taboo, and this taboo has evolved with time. In Victorian literature, where repression and propriety were paramount, the werewolf often stood in for forbidden desires. Sexuality, especially homosexuality, was a common subtext. The change was not just a loss of control, it was exposure, a revelation of something that society had deemed unnatural. In these stories, the horror was as much social as physical. The wolf didn't just kill, it unmasked. That same dynamic reappeared in the 20th century with the rise of body horror. Directors and authors used the werewolf to explore not just identity, but the betrayal of the body, the moment when your own flesh turns against you, when hair sprouts, bones break, hunger overrides morality, when your reflection becomes a stranger. The transformation scenes in films like The Howling, An American Werewolf in London, and Ginger Snaps are disturbing not because of the final form, but because of the process, the agony of it, the loss of self, the realization that something inside you is stronger than your will to stop it. And yet this same horror is also seductive, because for some, the transformation is not a punishment, it is freedom. In many modern narratives, the werewolf is not just feared, it is envied. The wolf runs when we cannot. It fights back. It speaks with force when the human is silent. It feels without filter. This duality, fear and desire, gives the myth its enduring tension. We are terrified of the werewolf because it represents loss of control. But we are drawn to it because it represents release. The release from conformity, from politeness, from civility, from the burden of pretending. This is why, in contemporary storytelling, the werewolf often appears in stories about transformation from victim to survivor. The character who is hurt, abused, oppressed, who then becomes something powerful, unstoppable. The wolf is not always the villain. Sometimes it is the weapon. This theme runs through speculative fiction, urban fantasy, even superhero narratives. The bite becomes not just an affliction, but an awakening. A new identity, forged in pain, but wielded with purpose. Yet even here, the price remains. Because to become something new, you must leave something behind. In most werewolf stories, there is a cost: relationships, memory, humanity. The question is not whether the transformation is real. The question is whether it's worth it. And this is where the myth becomes deeply philosophical. Because the werewolf is not just a creature, it is a question. What are we willing to become to survive? How much of ourselves are we willing to lose? Can the beast be controlled? Or is control itself the real illusion? In ancient myths, this question was posed in religious terms. The wolf was a punishment from the gods or a sign of divine wrath. In modern stories, it becomes psychological. The wolf is trauma, repression, anger, grief. But in all cases, it asks the same thing. What do we do with the parts of ourselves that don't fit? Do we chain them? Do we hide them? Do we embrace them? And what happens when they break free? The werewolf myth thrives because it refuses to offer easy answers. It does not tell us what is right, it shows us what is possible, and then leaves us to wrestle with the aftermath. And so we return, again and again, to the woods, to the place where rules blur, where sounds change, where the light fades. Because something waits there, not just to frighten us, but to reflect us. And if we listen closely, we might hear it. A breath in the leaves, a crack in the underbrush, the soft tread of paws circling the fire. There's a reason the werewolf returns in times of social upheaval. It is during crises, when norms are tested, when fear spreads like smoke, that the myths we thought we outgrew come roaring back. The werewolf is never just a story about claws and fangs. It is a barometer. It registers our anxieties and magnifies them, turning inner conflict into something visible, something monstrous. In the 19th century, as industrialization transformed Europe and America, the werewolf crept into the cracks left behind by progress. Railroads sliced through forests, gaslights banished the dark, science declared mastery over nature. But beneath the surface, there was unease. Cities were crowded, disease moved faster, class divides grew sharper. The old order trembled, and in the alleys and tenements of the newly built cities, the wolf returned, not to the wilderness, but to the heart of civilization. Writers of the era sensed the contradiction, that the more civilized society became, the more it needed the myth of the beast. In Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1886, there is no literal werewolf, but the theme is unmistakable. Jekyll, a respected doctor, creates a potion that releases his darker self, Mr. Hyde. The transformation is not into an animal, but into a primal human, violent, instinctive, liberated from morality. It is lycanthropy in everything but name. The story terrified Victorian readers because it struck at the heart of their greatest fear, that evil was not a foreign threat, but internal, that the beast wore a top hat, that he could be you. This fear only grew in the 20th century. In the trenches of World War I, soldiers described the enemy not in political terms, but as animals, hordes, wolves, monsters. It was easier to dehumanize than to comprehend the scale of destruction. After the war, poets and artists tried to make sense of what had happened. Many turned to the monstrous, the grotesque, the liminal, the werewolf, once feared as myth, now served as metaphor for a truth no one wanted to name, that under pressure, the human being could become unrecognizable. This theme deepened with World War II. The Holocaust, totalitarian regimes, mass violence, these were not acts of monsters. They were committed by ordinary people, made extraordinary by ideology and fear. The myth of transformation became horribly literal. In response, post-war literature and cinema explored monsters not as villains, but as reflections. The werewolf, in particular, became a figure of sympathy, a cursed man, a reluctant killer, someone who did not ask for power, but who could not refuse it. This was the era of the Wolfman, 1941, Curse of the Werewolf, 1961, and later, Wolfen, 1981, films where the monster is as much a victim as a threat. But the sympathy was never total, because the myth works best when it is ambiguous. Is the werewolf guilty for what he does while transformed? Is the transformation his true self, or is it a disease, a spell, a metaphor for what happens when repression breaks? The answers shift with each era, and in that shifting, the myth stays alive. In the 21st century, the werewolf has become more than a horror figure. It has entered pop culture with full saturation. It exists in cartoons, young adult novels, video games, romantic dramas. Some critics argue that this has diluted the legend, that it has been commercialized, tamed. But perhaps that misses the point. The werewolf's greatest strength has always been its adaptability. It doesn't need to be feared to be meaningful. It just needs to speak to something real. And it still does. Because even now, with all our science and screens, we remain creatures of instinct. We still struggle with anger, jealousy, shame, desire. We still wonder what we are capable of, what hides beneath the roles we play, and we still feel the pull of the forest, not literally, but symbolically. The forest is where things are lost, where we go when the map ends, where logic fails and myth begins. It's why so many werewolf stories start in the woods, and why, even now, people report sightings of strange creatures in dark places, not because they believe in fur and fangs, but because they believe in fear. Because there's still something about the howl, the way it cuts through silence, the way it makes us look over our shoulder, wondering if we are alone. The werewolf, at its core, is not a question of biology. It is a question of boundary. What divides us from what we fear? What divides the self from the shadow? The human from the hunger? This is what makes the myth so enduring, not the details, not the silver, bullets or full moons or bitten wrists, but the structure underneath, the confrontation between what we are and what we pretend to be. That confrontation takes many forms. Sometimes it's psychological, the inner child who was never allowed to rage. Sometimes it's political, the citizen told to conform, to obey, to sit still. Sometimes it's personal, the moment you feel the mask slip and something wild looks out through your eyes. In all these cases, the werewolf is not the danger. The denial is. The refusal to acknowledge the beast within is what gives it power, what makes it break through. This is why so many modern werewolf stories focus on control, not just the loss of it, but the management of it. The character learns to anticipate the change, to prepare, to make peace with it, or at least survive it. The transformation becomes a cycle, like grief, or addiction, or healing. It is no longer a single moment. It is a process. And in that process, there is room for choice. Not always victory, but choice. To chain oneself, to protect others, to run away, to surrender. Each option carries weight. And in that weight, the werewolf remains one of the most human monsters we have ever imagined. Not because it is least monstrous, but because it is the most us. We return to the fire, to the ancient image of the circle of light surrounded by darkness. This is where the werewolf was born, not in the archives of lore or the pages of medical treatises, but in the hush between words, in the moment when someone leans forward and says, "Let me tell you what I heard." This is the power of the myth. It survives not by institution, but by transmission. A story passed from voice to ear, a warning wrapped in wonder, a mirror passed hand to hand until we forget who held it first, and in that mirror, the wolf watches. By now, we have traced the arc across cultures and centuries. We've seen the werewolf evolve from sacred transformation to punishment, from medieval horror to psychological metaphor, from pagan rite to postmodern symbol. And still, it moves. It adapts. Because it was never truly about wolves. It was always about us, what we fear, what we repress, what we might become. In the most enduring werewolf stories, the monster is not evil. It is broken, isolated, misunderstood. It lashes out not from malice, but from pain. It cannot explain itself. It cannot undo the damage. It is, in the truest sense, a tragedy. This is not weakness. It is humanity, because the beast we fear is not always someone else. Often, it is the part of us that was never allowed to speak, the part that was silenced, shamed, beaten down, the part that still remembers what it was to run without apology. This is what makes the werewolf more than a cautionary tale. It is a redemption story, if we let it be. Because what if the transformation is not the end, but the beginning? What if the howl is not a threat, but a signal? What if the forest is not a prison, but a path? In some of the oldest werewolf tales, the cursed man is given a task: to learn, to repent, to serve, to protect. The transformation is not permanent. It is a trial, a reckoning. And when passed, the curse is lifted. These stories are rare, but they matter, because they suggest that what has been broken can be healed, that the beast can be taught to live alongside the man, that the duality we carry does not have to destroy us. In modern adaptations, this theme re-emerges in stories of found family, of pack loyalty, of integration. The werewolf does not walk alone. He finds others. He learns control not through suppression, but through relationship, through love, through acceptance. This shift is not sentimental. It is revolutionary, because it dares to imagine that the beast within is not ashamed to be hidden, but a truth to be understood, a source of power, a source of empathy, a way of being that honors instinct without abandoning responsibility. In these stories, the werewolf becomes something else entirely, not a villain, not a victim, but a new kind of being, whole, changed, awake. And in this vision, the myth comes full circle. Back to the fire, back to the question we always feared to ask. What if the monster is not the end of the story? What if it's the beginning of the self? This is where myth becomes medicine. Because when we see the werewolf not just as a threat, but as a teacher, something changes. We stop asking how to kill it. We start asking what it wants, what it knows, what it remembers that we forgot, and what it can show us, if we're brave enough to listen. Not all stories end in fire. Some end in the forest, in the quiet, in the long breath after the chase, when the moon has set, and the wolf, just for a moment, is still. Even after the fire goes out, the story lingers. It clings to the ash, to the silence that follows. Because the most powerful myths are not those that end, they are those that echo. And the werewolf, more than most, is built from echoes, of instinct, of inheritance, of the unspeakable. The first 10 parts of this journey trace the history, psychology, and symbolism of the werewolf, but there is more still beneath the surface. Layers of cultural tension and spiritual resonance that go beyond fear. To fully understand the werewolf, one must explore the soul of the myth, its sacredness, its rebellion, its invitation. In many indigenous cultures, transformation is not a curse, it is a calling. Among the Navajo people of the American Southwest, stories of skinwalkers, Yinaldlushi, describe witches who can transform into animals, most often wolves, coyotes, or owls. These beings are feared, yes, but their power is respected. They are not werewolves in the Western sense. They do not lose control, they choose to change. But they represent a similar concept: liminality, the crossing of sacred thresholds, the ability to move between human and animal, life and death, seen and unseen. What makes these tales powerful is their context. They are not simply ghost stories, they are spiritual warnings. They exist within a belief system that honors balance, between nature and humanity, between tribe and individual, between self and shadow. In this context, transformation is not inherently evil, it is dangerous, which is not the same thing. This distinction matters, because in Western thought, particularly post-Enlightenment, the supernatural is often framed in binary terms: good or evil, order or chaos, sanity or madness. The werewolf, caught between categories, becomes problematic. He cannot be classified. He resists control. And so, he must be cast out. But in more fluid cosmologies, the shapeshifter holds a different role. He is not a cautionary tale. He is a reminder, a living symbol of how fragile the boundaries are and how essential it is to know what lies beyond them. This is why, in some shamanic traditions, the wolf is not feared. It is followed. It leads the spirit through visions. It guards the soul during sickness. It brings messages from the other world. This reverence exists even in places where wolves themselves were hunted to extinction. The memory outlives the body. The myth persists, even when the animal is gone. There is something in the wolf that humans recognize, not just as predator, but as parallel. The wolf lives in packs, so do we. The wolf howls when alone, so do we. The wolf fights to protect its kin, so do we. But the wolf also retreats when wounded, so do we. The wolf mourns its dead, so do we. This mirroring explains why the myth is so persistent. It is not based on a stranger. It is based on a sibling, and siblings, even when they fight, remain bound. In Norse mythology, the god Odin is accompanied by two wolves, Geri and Freki. They are not symbols of evil. They are his companions, his watchers. They devour the offerings of warriors. They exist alongside ravens, symbolizing thought and memory. Even the end of the world, Ragnarok, is ushered in by a wolf, Fenrir, the great beast, who breaks his chains and swallows the sun. Is Fenrir a villain? Yes and no. He is fated to destroy, but also fated to exist. His presence is necessary for the cycle to begin again. Without the wolf, there is no renewal, no rebirth. This cyclical understanding of destruction and transformation lies at the heart of the werewolf myth. Once you strip away the horror tropes, the beast does not simply attack. He reveals what is rotting. He exposes the lie. He breaks the shell so that something new might emerge. Which is why, in some modern interpretations, the werewolf is the healer. The one who has been through darkness and returned. The one who carries both pain and power. The one who understands suffering not as a weakness, but as a guide. In Jungian psychology, this figure would be the wounded healer, a person who has walked through shadow and can now help others find the path. The werewolf, in this model, is not a destroyer. He is a survivor, and survival itself becomes sacred. This shift is not universal. Many still prefer the werewolf as villain, as chaos incarnate, but even in these stories, the themes remain. The hunger, the duality, the transformation. Whether feared or revered, the figure stands, ancient, enduring, watching, and waiting. Because here is the final truth of the werewolf myth. It is not about the monster. It is about the moment. The moment when you stop pretending. The moment when the mask slips. The moment when instinct overrides pretense. That moment may last a second, a night, a lifetime, but it changes you. And once changed, you cannot go back. You may return to town, to speech, to form, to family, but the memory remains. The feeling of running on four limbs, the taste of wind in your teeth, the silence of understanding a world without words. And that memory, once awakened, becomes something else. It becomes longing. This is the final layer of the werewolf myth. Not fear, not violence, not power, but longing. For a self unbound, for a world unshaped by shame, for a howl that doesn't echo back as silence. It is a longing that cannot be explained to those who have never felt it, only lived, only remembered, only passed down in stories told in low voices by people who have seen too much and said too little. The ones who look at the full moon, not with terror, but with recognition. The moon has always known. Before clocks, before calendars, before borders and flags, the moon measured time for those who lived with the earth. It pulled tides and whispered to crops. It marked cycles of birth, blood, and bone. And in the myth of the werewolf, it became something more. A witness, a trigger, a judge. Why does the full moon so often signal the transformation? Why not storms or solstices or sleep? There's no physical reason, no scientific force that compels flesh to shift when lunar light falls. And yet, across cultures and centuries, the full moon returns again and again as the moment of change. It is not a coincidence. It is a symbol, because the moon does not shine. It reflects. It has no light of its own. It is a mirror suspended in the sky, reminding us of what we would rather forget. That even in darkness, something watches, something glows, something waits. The werewolf transforms under the full moon because it is a moment of revelation. The moon is not just a lamp, it is a stage light. It illuminates what has been hidden, calls it forward, demands that it be seen. This is why, in story after story, the transformation is involuntary. The character cannot choose when to change. He is summoned, not by magic, but by inevitability. The full moon reveals, and what it reveals is not always welcome. The association between the moon and madness is ancient. The word lunacy comes from luna, Latin for moon. It reflects a time when people believed that seizures, hallucinations, and emotional instability were caused by lunar influence. Even today, emergency rooms, police officers, and mental health workers speak of full moon shifts, nights when things seem different. Is it myth or is it memory? A cellular memory, perhaps, of a time when humans were not separate from nature, but shaped by it. When the moon's waxing and waning influenced not just oceans, but choices. When transformation was not metaphor, it was law. This idea remains embedded in us, no matter how many walls we build. It's why the idea of change under moonlight still strikes a chord. Why the image of a man looking up, feeling his bones ache, his skin crawl, remains potent. Because we recognize it, not as fantasy, but as a kind of truth, a rhythm, a call, and within that call, there is more than fear. There is grief, because every transformation, no matter how empowering, requires a death, not literal, but symbolic, a shedding of illusion, of safety, of self-image. The man who becomes a wolf does not die, but something does. A version of him, a mask, a memory. The transformation costs something, and that cost must be paid every time. This repetition is critical. In most werewolf stories, the transformation is not a one-time event. It is a cycle. It returns, like tides, like trauma, like seasons. The character may try to outrun it, cure it, suppress it, but it comes back, because the myth is not about destruction. It is about recurrence. The myth says, you do not become the beast once. You become it again and again. And with each change, you remember what it felt like, what you did, what you lost. This is the sorrow beneath the savagery, that the werewolf is not simply a killer, but a penitent. He remembers, and that memory gnaws at him. This is why many stories frame the werewolf as a reluctant figure, a man who locks himself up, who chains himself to trees, who begs others to flee. He knows what's coming. He knows what he becomes, and yet he cannot stop it. The horror is not the loss of control, it's the return of it, afterward. When the wolf recedes and the man remains, naked, bloodied, bewildered, left to ask, who did I become? And worse, who will I become again? This structure mirrors real experiences of dissociation, addiction, rage, and grief. States where a person acts or feels acted upon, and then must re-enter themselves, stunned by the damage, unsure how to proceed. The myth of the werewolf is not about a stranger. It is about returning to the self after that self has cracked. And it's about the moon. Because the moon reminds us, this will happen again. The cycle is part of it, not to punish, but to teach. And what does the werewolf learn? That to be human is not to be tame. That instinct does not disappear with language. That wildness can be suppressed, but never eliminated. The werewolf learns that the self is not singular. It is layered, shadowed, shifting, and within that learning lies a kind of grace, because to know this is to stop pretending, to stop drawing lines between us and them, between human and animal, between civilized and savage. The werewolf myth asks, what if there is no line? What if the beast is not a departure, but a return? What if it is not regression, but remembering? This is why, in some modern retellings, the transformation is welcomed, not as power, but as wholeness. The character accepts the wolf, integrates it, learns to live with it, not by denying its nature, but by honoring it, by giving it space, by giving it purpose. This is the Jungian path, not the exile of the shadow, but its embrace. The wolf is no longer a curse, it is an ally. It is still dangerous, yes, but so are fire and water and wind. Danger is not the enemy. Unconsciousness is the werewolf becomes conscious. And in that consciousness, the story evolves. It becomes not a horror story, but a myth of return. To the body, to the earth, to the self before shame, to the voice that howled before it learned to whisper. And the moon, it still shines, still watches, still waits, not to curse, but to call, to remind us that cycles are not failures, they are life, and that to walk through them, not once, but many times, is not to be damned, it is to be human. There's a silence that follows the howl, a silence not of fear, but of stillness, the kind that comes when the storm has passed, when the breath slows, when the blood dries. It is here, in the quiet aftermath, that the werewolf myth reveals its final shape, not as horror, not as punishment, but as a map. A myth is never just a story. It is a survival guide. It shows us what has been hidden. It warns us what must not be forgotten. And it carries within it the memory of a people, a wound, a wisdom. The werewolf legend is no different. Beneath the fur and fangs lies something older, a way to live with what scares us, a way to endure what would otherwise destroy us. For centuries, the werewolf has been a monster, a scapegoat, a shadow. But in modern times, a new vision is emerging, one that views the transformation not as a failure of humanity, but as an opportunity for integration, for healing, for reconciliation between the mind and the body, the soul and the instinct, the past and the present. In this vision, the werewolf is not hunted, he is listened to, and what he says is this: you are not just one thing. You are not just who you appear to be. You are not only the mask you wear in daylight. You are everything you've survived, everything you've buried, everything that still aches beneath your skin. The werewolf becomes a model for wholeness, not in spite of the beast, but because of it. This is the medicine hidden in the myth. We live in a world that punishes anger, stigmatizes grief, and commodifies identity. We are taught to package ourselves, to perform, to be acceptable. But what happens to the parts we leave out? The wild parts, the wounded parts, the watchful, howling parts. They don't disappear. They wait, and the longer we ignore them, the louder they get, until something breaks. This is where the werewolf comes in, not as a cautionary tale, but as a mirror, a teacher, a story that tells us it is not wrong to be wild. It is not shameful to feel rage. It is not unnatural to want to run until the noise stops. The myth says the beast is part of you, not all of you, but part, and you must learn to walk with it, not behind it, not in front of it, with it. This lesson appears in contemporary literature, especially in stories of trauma recovery. The werewolf becomes a metaphor for PTSD, for chronic illness, for intergenerational pain. The transformation is no longer a horror trope, it is a symptom, a signal, a scar, and scars, as we know, are proof of healing. Not erasure, not perfection, but survival. The shift in how we tell werewolf stories reflects a broader shift in how we view ourselves. We are moving away from binaries, good and evil, man and beast, sane and mad, and toward spectrums, toward complexity, toward stories that allow for contradiction. The werewolf fits this perfectly. Because he is contradiction, he is the warrior and the orphan, the killer and the protector, the exile and the guide. He is what happens when transformation is not just accepted, but honored. In some modern mythologies, the werewolf joins a pack. not to lose his individuality, but to find community. The pack becomes a metaphor for chosen family, for those who accept you even when you are changing, especially when you are changing. This is radical, because it challenges the idea that transformation must be done alone. It says, there is a place for you, even as a wolf. Even when you are not at your best, even when you don't have the words. This communal aspect reframes the werewolf myth from one of exile to one of belonging, and belonging is perhaps the deepest human need of all. In the original tales, the werewolf wandered the woods, alone, feared, cursed. But in these new retellings, he is welcomed back. Not because he is tame, but because he is true, because he no longer pretends to be something he is not. This truth-telling is what myth is made for. It allows us to say things we are not yet ready, to admit in our own voice. It gives us a mask that reveals more than it hides. The werewolf then becomes not a lie, but a language, a way to speak the unspeakable, to howl when words fail, to mourn what was lost, to name what lives on. And in this naming, there is power. Because once the beast has a name, it is no longer just a threat. It is part of the story. It has a role to play, a role in protection, in resistance, in rebirth. This is not to romanticize violence. The werewolf still wounds, still kills, still breaks. But even in his most brutal form, he carries truth. That there is a wildness in all of us. That to deny it is dangerous. That to integrate it is sacred. And sacredness, once reclaimed, changes everything. It makes the forest a temple, the moon a mentor, the scar a map, the howl a hymn. Every myth leaves a trail, not just in books or stories, but in the bones of the culture that carries it. These trails are not always visible. Some are felt more than seen. They shape how we think, what we fear, and who we imagine ourselves to be. The werewolf myth is one such trail. It winds through the dark forests of medieval Europe, across the ritual fires of Siberian shamans, through whispered courtrooms, psychiatric wards, and teenage bedrooms. It is not confined to one time or place. It is everywhere. It is in many ways one of the most global monsters humanity has ever invented. And still, we invent it, again and again, because the werewolf does not belong to the past. It lives in the present. It adapts, evolves, mutates, not unlike the creature it describes. And in doing so, it reveals something essential about myth itself. That myths are not relics, they are tools. We use them to process what we can't explain, to navigate change, to face what logic alone cannot hold. This is why, in the modern age of media saturation, artificial intelligence, and digitized existence, the werewolf still finds a place. In novels, in graphic stories, in therapy rooms, in YouTube playlists labeled Dark Folklore Explained, in the subreddits where people write confessions they won't speak aloud, because the wolf still waits. Not outside the village walls, but inside the algorithm, inside the nervous system, inside the unconscious. Modern myth-making is not about oracles and runes. It's about storytelling. And storytelling is everywhere, on screens, in scrolling feeds, in the endless reframing of identity that happens each time someone posts a version of themselves online. We curate, we perform, we try to appear tame. But sometimes the beast shows. The post written in rage, the breakdown caught on camera, the outburst that reveals the person we swore we weren't, and the werewolf reappears, not in the story, but in the reaction. Did you see what she did? He wasn't himself. It was like she became someone else. These are not just expressions. They are myth in motion. They are evidence that we still believe in transformation, even when we don't use the word, even when we call it a meltdown, or a snap, or a crisis. We are still telling the same story, that under the right conditions, a human being can change. Into what? That depends. Sometimes it's a killer, Sometimes it's a survivor. Sometimes it's a version of the self that feels more real than any that came before. In this sense, the werewolf has become one of the most flexible mythic templates of the 21st century, a story shape that can hold countless meanings: gender transition, neurodivergence, suppressed trauma, rage, grief, awakening, addiction, healing. It is a container, a symbol, a placeholder for what doesn't fit anywhere else. This adaptability is not accidental. It is the secret of myth's survival. A myth that cannot evolve will die. A myth that can change will never fade. And so the werewolf persists. In books that explore shapeshifters as metaphors for dysphoria, in films where transformation is an act of protest, in music, videos where the wolf is seduction, resistance, or freedom, even in advertising, the werewolf appears, tamed, branded, marketed, but still there. Still, reminding us that wildness is never far, that identity is fluid, that transformation is a process, not a punishment. But with this power comes responsibility. Because myth-making is not neutral. It shapes how we treat ourselves and others. If we tell werewolf stories that only end in violence, we risk reinforcing the idea that the beast must be destroyed. If we tell stories where the werewolf is only male, only white, only heteronormative, we limit the myth's reach. If we make the werewolf only a monster, we miss the chance to see him as a symbol of integration. This is why contemporary storytellers are reshaping the legend, giving the wolf a new face, a new voice, a new home. And, not just in fantasy, in memoir, in performance art, in virtual reality, in fan fiction, in community healing circles. The werewolf is not just a genre character anymore. He is a means of exploring the question: what does it mean to be fully human? Not just polite, not just civilized, not just productive, but wild, complex, cyclical, messy, and real. This is the final frontier of the myth, not to scare, not to entertain, but to liberate, to offer a vision of the self that is not bound by purity or constancy or control, but one that includes the night, the blood, the change. This version of the werewolf is not one you run from. It is one you walk beside, the wolf who paces in rhythm with your breath, who guards the border between trauma and healing, who knows what it means to survive, and to carry that survival in your spine, to live in a body that remembers what the mind forgets, to feel everything too deeply, to change when the world demands you stay the same, and to keep walking. Not because you are cursed, but because you were called. Because you are not a monster, you are a myth in motion, and your howl is not a threat. It is a story waiting to be heard. The werewolf is not gone. He walks among us, though not as we once imagined, not as a creature skulking through misty woods, blood on his muzzle and moonlight in his eyes, but as something quieter, closer. He walks in how we speak about pain, in how we carry shame, in how we learn to live with what cannot be undone. He is not waiting to pounce. He is waiting to be recognized. The myth, now fully evolved, has left behind its chains. It no longer depends on silver bullets or cursed bloodlines. It is no longer confined to villages or battlefields or nightmares. It lives in the body. The modern werewolf is embodied. He is a person navigating transformation in real time, not with magic, but with memory, not with spells, but with scars. And this embodiment is not metaphor alone. It is physical, the heartbeat that changes under stress, the breath that shortens when danger returns, the ache in bones when a trauma resurfaces. These are the transformations that myth has always tried to name, the changes that modern language still stumbles around. The werewolf gives us that language, not as diagnosis, as story. He allows us to describe what it feels like to be human in a world that often denies humanity, to live in a body that betrays, that surprises, that defends. A body that shifts not just with time, but with touch, with temperature, with terror. This is why embodiment matters, because myth becomes real when it is felt. And the werewolf has always been about feeling, not thought, not intellect, but hunger, fury, sorrow, shame. He is the body acting on what the mind cannot say, and in this he offers a gift. He offers permission to feel what has been suppressed, to move what has been frozen, to speak what has been silenced. He is not safe, but he is honest. And honesty in a culture of performance is radical. In many indigenous traditions, shapeshifting was not an escape from the body, but a deeper entry into it, a way of aligning the inner self with the outer form. The dance, the chant, the trance, all of it was a return to the original language of flesh and breath. The modern werewolf echoes this, not as ritual, but as survival. For those who live with complex trauma or neurodivergence or suppressed identity, the werewolf is not just a symbol, he is a fellow traveler, someone who knows what it means to lose control and to find meaning in that loss. Not to celebrate it blindly, but to understand it fully, to reclaim what was stolen, dignity, agency, belonging, and stitch it back into a body that is always changing. This reclamation is powerful, because in most traditional werewolf stories, the transformation was forced. The character did not choose it. It happened to him. But in newer narratives, the power shifts. The werewolf is still changed, but now he can choose how to carry that change, whether to pass it on, whether to own it. This is the moment the myth turns from curse to initiation, from exile to embodiment, from legend to legacy. The legacy is what matters now. Not the fear, not the blood, but what comes after. How the myth lives. How it walks beside us, in rituals of healing, in stories told to children who feel different, in poems written by survivors, in art drawn by those who have seen the inside of the beast. The legacy is how we turn pain into narrative, so it does not eat us from within. It is how we howl, not in despair, but in declaration. It is how we say, "This happened, I changed, I am still here." In this telling, the werewolf is not just a monster or a metaphor, he is a guide, not because he has answers, but because he knows the questions, knows what it is to break, knows what it is to rebuild, knows what it is to feel the full moon rising in your bones and wonder if you will survive it this time, knows what it is to come back, not unchanged, but whole. This wholeness is not perfection. It is not the end of struggle. It is the acceptance of the cycle, the agreement to keep walking, to let the myth walk with you to become its next chapter, because myths do not die, they evolve. And the werewolf, ancient, ageless, ever adapting, is still evolving now, through you, through me, through every person who has ever felt the wildness stir, who has ever looked at their reflection and seen something unfamiliar, who has ever changed and lived to tell the tale. A story survives because someone keeps telling it, not because it is written down, but because it is remembered, embodied, spoken aloud in moments of vulnerability, of warning, of wonder. Stories like the werewolf legend are not static. They are living ecosystems shaped by those who carry them across generations and geographies. This is the final arc of the myth, not the transformation of the man into the wolf, but the transformation of the myth into a shared inheritance. The werewolf belongs to no single culture, though its shape varies, from Europe's loup-garou to Africa's were-hyena, from India's rakshasa to Japan's kitsune lore. The core structure repeats: transformation, fear, exile, reckoning. And through this shared structure, we glimpse something profound, that across continents and eras, people have told stories of what happens when identity slips, when the boundary between human and other dissolves. When something wild, something sacred or shameful, emerges from within. These are not coincidences. They are reflections of a common human experience, of change. We are born changers. Our bodies morph. Our beliefs shift. Our relationships evolve. And with every change comes the need to make sense of it, to frame it, to give it shape. Myth does this. The werewolf is a story told by people who understood that change is frightening and necessary. And now, in the modern era of globalization, climate crisis, digital identity, and cultural resurgence, the myth is more relevant than ever. Because now we are not only changing as individuals, we are changing as a species. The world is moving faster than our nervous systems were built to handle. The forests are burning. The polar ice is retreating. The social contracts are fraying. The algorithms know more about us than our elders do. In this climate of instability, stories that speak to inner instability become anchors. And the werewolf is one such anchor. Not because it promises comfort, but because it validates chaos. It says, yes, you are not who you were. Yes, the rules are different now. Yes, the old self is gone. But no, you are not alone. Because transformation is older than language. And the howl you feel building inside your ribcage is not madness, it is memory. This memory lives in cultures that have been colonized, displaced, forgotten. It lives in songs and dances and symbols carried through forced silence. It lives in tattoo and scar. It lives in the way stories refuse to die, even when they are banned, mocked, or sold back in pieces. In many indigenous and diasporic communities, shapeshifting remains a sacred metaphor for survival. The wolf, the jaguar, the bear, the serpent, these are not villains. They are guardians, ancestors, deities. Their stories are not horror, they are heritage. And the modern werewolf myth, if it is to endure with integrity, must honor this truth. It must recognize that to tell a story of transformation is also to tell a story of trauma, of migration, of resistance, of adaptation. Because shapeshifting is what oppressed peoples have always done to survive. You hide your name. You learn the colonizer's language. You pass as something you are not. You learn to walk with your ears open, to breathe with your eyes closed, to howl when no one can hear you. This is why the werewolf is now being reclaimed, not just in fiction, but in cultural theory, in art collectives, in queer zines and anti-colonial podcasts. He is no longer the other. He is us. He is the shapeshifter who learned to live in two skins, who learned to speak two truths, who learned to stay alive by becoming something else. But now the tide is turning again. Now the wolf returns, not to hide, but to speak, to teach, to remind us that the story we were told was only half of it, that the werewolf is not the end of civilization. He is the sign it has grown too rigid, that the transformation is not a fall, it is a return to balance. This is why elders in many cultures teach not to fear the wild creature, but to honor it, not to chain the instinct, but to listen to what it says. What makes the werewolf dangerous is not the transformation. It's the denial of it, the refusal to let people change, the refusal to let stories evolve, the refusal to recognize the sacred in what we were taught to fear. And so we write new stories, we gather in digital packs, in cultural circles, in healing spaces. We tell each other, yes, I have changed. Yes, I lost myself. Yes, I found something in that darkness, and I brought it back. That is how a myth is preserved, not by repeating it, but by living it again, with new breath, by giving it to the next person not as a relic, but as a gift. Here, this helped me survive. Here, this made me remember who I am. Here, this taught me how to howl without apology. And in that gift, the myth lives. in the parent who teaches their child that feeling too much is not wrong, in the friend who sits beside someone during their darkest shift and says, "I'm still here," in the artist who paints wolves not as monsters, but as mirrors, in the activist who names rage as sacred, in the healer who says, "The part of you you're afraid of, that part is wise." These are the new storytellers. They do not burn witches. They do not fear fangs. They write on walls, in code, in scars, in ceremony. And what they write is this: the beast is not coming. The beast has always been here, and it has something to say. The final leg of any journey is the return home, not to the place you left, but to the self that waited while you were gone. The werewolf's journey has always been circular. He begins as man, becomes beast, and, if he survives, becomes something else. Not a man again. Not quite. Something changed. Something larger. Something truer. But not every werewolf story ends in fire or death. Some end in the quiet of understanding that you were never supposed to stay one thing forever, that you were always meant to change. Transformation, once seen as curse, reveals itself as process. The myth makes room for this, not as spectacle, but as reflection. And in that reflection, something unexpected begins to appear. Tenderness. We do not often associate tenderness with monsters, but in the stillness after rage, in the breath after the howl, there is space for softness, for remorse, for recognition. The beast is not just fury, he is grief, he is memory. He is all the things the world told you not to feel, until you had no choice but to feel them all at once. This is where the myth becomes personal. No longer a legend passed from village to village, but a story whispered in your own chest, a truth you carry in your shoulders, in your gut, in the parts of you that tighten when you are asked to stay small. To speak of werewolves now is not to speak of folklore. It is to speak of the times you almost lost yourself, of the times you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back, of the nights you wept from a hunger you couldn't name, of the moments you heard yourself snarl, not in words, but in silence. This is your myth too, because everyone has a beast they try to chain. Everyone has a full moon that brings them undone. And everyone at some point has wondered, if I let this part of me live, will there be anything left of me? The myth does not offer an answer. It offers a place to ask, to sit beside the fire of your own heart and let the animal inside you breathe, not to control it, not to cage it, but to meet it, to hear what it has been trying to say through the rage, the shame, the dreams you wake from sweating, that it was never trying to hurt you, it was trying to keep you alive. This is the shift that happens near the end of every real myth. The monster is revealed not as destroyer, but as protector, misunderstood, mistrusted, but loyal. The werewolf within you, the one that lashes out, that withdraws, that grieves too loudly, is not the part that broke you. It is the part that survived. And that survival deserves reverence. It deserves language. It deserves the dignity of myth. To speak your truth as a legend is not to exaggerate. It is to honor what was too heavy to hold in ordinary words. This is why we need monsters. To say what we could not say with clean hands and straight spines. To embody what could not be reasoned through. To become what could not be erased. The werewolf is the one who returns from that wilderness. Not cured, but conscious. Not pure, but present. He knows where the edge is now. He knows what it costs to cross it, and he knows how to come back. Not all the way, but far enough to speak, to tell others, yes, I went there. Yes, I changed. Yes, I still dream in teeth sometimes, but I am here. This kind of return is its own kind of magic, not transformation into something else, but into more of yourself. The self that holds contradiction, the self that remembers and forgives. The self that runs when it must, but also stays when it matters. This is the wisdom the myth points toward, that you are not one thing. You never were. You are man and beast, light and bone, shadow and breath. And the more of you learn to carry, the less often you will need to run. This does not mean the beast is gone, only that it is not alone, and that, sometimes, is enough. 2. Know that the fire you feared was not meant to burn you, but to illuminate the path, so that when the next person begins to change, they will know. This has happened before, and someone made it back. Stories don't end, they echo. Especially the old ones, the ones passed in breath, not books. The ones told when the fire is low and the world outside the door has gone quiet. These stories do not finish with the last word. They linger in the body, in the spaces between questions. They become ritual. And the werewolf story, perhaps more than any other, is a ritual in disguise. It does not ask to be believed, it asks to be felt. Because at its heart, this story is not about monsters. It is about returning to instinct, to memory, to the part of you that was never taught to speak, but always knew how to listen. In ancient cultures, ritual transformation was a sacred act. Masks were worn not to hide, but to reveal, to call forth what was waiting, to cross thresholds between the seen and unseen. A person would not pretend to be a wolf, they would become one, briefly, symbolically, and then return changed. This was not theatre. It was survival. To live in a world of uncertainty, of hunger, of spirits, of grief, meant you had to learn to carry more than oneself. The body you used in the village was not the body you needed in the forest. The voice you used at the fire was not the voice you needed in the cave. The werewolf myth carries that memory, even now. It reminds us that identity is not fixed, that masks are not always lies, that transformation can be sacred, and the ritual begins the moment we tell the story. To speak of the werewolf is to prepare for change. To name the beast is to invite understanding. To share the myth is to say, this path is known. You are not the first to lose yourself. You are not the first to come back. This, then, is where myth and ritual meet, in community. Because transformation is too much to hold alone. We need witnesses. We need listeners. We need someone to say, I heard the howl. I remember the shape of your fear. I see you now. This is what ritual provides. Not answers, but presence. Not certainty, but connection. And the werewolf, long thought to be the symbol of exile, becomes, at last, a symbol of return. Not just to self, but to others. This is why new werewolf stories center around pack, not just as metaphor, but as structure. Because in every tale where the beast is accepted, controlled, honored, it is not done alone. It is done through trust, through guidance, through someone who has been there before. This reflects the healing rituals of old, the circle, the song, the storytelling, the moment when one person speaks their truth and others nod, not to fix it, but to affirm it, to say, you're not strange, you're sacred, to say, that part of you that howls, it has a name, to say, you are not too much. This act of naming is itself a ritual. It breaks the spell of silence. It calls the fragmented self into one room. It makes the wild part welcome, in this sense. Every time we speak of the werewolf, we are performing a ritual. Each time we imagine him, on screen, in ink, in dream, we are rehearsing the truth that transformation is survivable. That instinct is not the enemy. That cycles are not shame. That we do not become less by becoming different. We become more. And when we tell these stories together, they stop being stories. They become maps. Maps of how to be with fear. Maps of how to lose and find ourselves again. Maps of how to live through change without erasing the parts that changed us. And so, the ritual continues. When a mother explains to her child why they cry when they're angry, When a friend holds space for a breakdown and says nothing but stays. When an artist paints herself with claws, not because she is violent, but because she is tired of hiding her defense. When someone walks into the woods, not to be alone, but to listen. These are werewolf stories. They just don't use that name. But the shape is the same. The arc still bends. From fear to transformation. From exile to return. From silence to story. From fragment to form. And that form is ritual. Sacred, lived, repeated. Not to summon a beast, but to remember a self. One that was never gone. Only waiting. Like a shadow in the trees. Like a heartbeat under fur. Like a name that had to be spoken 3 times before it answered. And when it does answer, the ritual is complete, not because it ends, but because it begins again, in someone else, around another fire, in another voice. To speak of the werewolf now is to speak in symbols. Because myth, once it reaches a certain depth, stops being about plot. It becomes a language, a way of making sense not through logic, but through resonance. And few symbols carry more layered meaning than the beast, the soul, and the circle. The beast is instinct. It is the part of us that reacts before thinking, the part that runs toward heat, that bares its teeth when threatened, that grieves with its whole body. It is not evil. It is essential. It protects the vulnerable. It warns us when something is wrong. In many stories, the beast is the enemy, something to be hunted, shamed, killed. But older stories knew better. They knew the beast was not to be feared, but to be honored. The warrior who ignored his instincts died first. The mother who silenced her inner growl lost her children. The healer who denied her intuition forgot how to listen. In the oldest myths, the beast is a companion, a totem, a guardian. The danger is not in becoming it. The danger is in forgetting it lives inside you. And so, the werewolf becomes not a tale of descent, but of remembrance. Of what it means to be fully alive in a body that feels, and in that feeling, ravenous, radiant, unruly, lives the soul. Not the floating, ethereal soul of sanitized theology, but the embodied, bone-deep soul that knows how to move through change without being destroyed. The soul that lives in the marrow, in the jaw, in the breath. The soul that shifts shape, not because it is lost, but because it is learning. This kind of soul cannot be contained in a single form. It needs cycles. It needs stories. It needs the circle. Because all myths at their heart are circles. They begin and end in the same place. But everything is different. The journey out is the transformation. The journey back is the integration. And the circle is what holds it all together. In werewolf stories, this circle appears again and again. The moon, the forest clearing, the pack gathered under night sky. The mark that cannot be removed. The return to the self. Even the storytelling itself is a circle. We began in history, in superstition, in the dark woods. We moved through fear, through fire, through exile. And now, we find ourselves back where we started, but seeing it with new eyes. Because once the werewolf is understood, the story doesn't end. It begins again, inside you, and the circle continues. Each generation draws it anew. Each person steps into its center and decides, what do I do with this part of me? Do I run from it? Do I chain it? Or do I sit beside it and ask what it remembers? The answer changes the shape of the myth, not just in books, but in lives. Because once we choose to welcome the beast, the soul, and the circle into our own journey, the werewolf ceases to be a monster. He becomes a mirror of our power, a mirror of our grief, a mirror of what it means to change and keep changing, and still belong. The myths that last are the ones that make space for becoming, and the werewolf has lasted because he holds space for all of it, for the howl in the throat of the one who has no words, for the silence in the chest of the one who has no home, for the clawed fist of the one who has had enough, for the open palm of the one who's ready to begin again. This is the gift of the beast. This is the wisdom of the circle. And this is the story we pass down, not to scare, but to prepare. Because whether you believe in the werewolf or not, one thing is certain. One day, you will change. And when that day comes, may you remember this story. May you recognize the forest. May you feel the pull of the moon. May you know you are not alone, and may you step into the circle, not as a stranger, but as someone who knows the way home. In every story that survives, there is a doorway. Sometimes it's hidden behind metaphor. Sometimes it's carved into stone. Sometimes it's only opened by grief. The werewolf myth is one such doorway. We began at the threshold of ancient fear of beasts in the dark, of men who changed, of sins punished with fur and fang. We trace the story across time and continents, through sacred rites and medieval trials, through literature, cinema, psychology, and personal transformation. Each chapter peeled back another layer, but now we arrive at the final threshold. Not an ending, a return, because what the werewolf teaches, more than anything, is that nothing ends. Not really. It shifts, it sheds, it remembers, and then it becomes again. This is what myth offers us, not closure, but cycle. It's no accident that werewolf stories always seem to loop. The man changes, loses himself, regains himself, and then waits for the next moon, the next trigger, the next return. He is not cured. He is conscious. That consciousness is the final gift. Not power, not peace, but the ability to stay present in the midst of becoming, to walk into the night with eyes open, to listen for the old songs, to feel the bodies tremble not as a warning, but as a memory awakening, because every transformation carries a memory. Every myth holds an ancestor, and the werewolf, despite what we've been told, is not a solitary creature. He walks with the echoes of everyone who came before. He carries them in his gait. He sings them in his howl. And when he finds the circle again, his pack, his place, his voice, he is not returning to safety. He is returning to story. Because the story is the true home, not the body, not the name, but the narrative, the thing that holds you when everything else is shifting. The thing you carry even when your reflection changes. The thing you pass on, not as doctrine, but as offering. So, now, as this story draws its breath before becoming someone else's, we leave it not with a warning, but with a remembering. You are not just the version of yourself that others understand. You are not just the tame shape you wear to be loved. You are every version, every shape, every season of your soul. You are the one who ran when no one listened. You are the one who fought back in silence. You are the one who changed and kept changing, and you are the one who lived to tell it. The werewolf myth is yours now, not because you believe in monsters, but because you know what it means to survive transformation, to be marked by it, to mourn what it took, and to still choose to walk forward into the next cycle, the next story, the next moon. Maybe you'll tell it in whispers, maybe you'll write it down, maybe you'll carry it in your bones and say nothing. But it will be with you, because once a myth recognizes you, it does not let go. It walks with you, it waits with you. It teaches you how to hold space for the wild things in others, how to hear the howl beneath someone's breath, how to name the sacred in what was once feared, and how to walk beside the beast, not as enemy, not as burden, but as part of the self that remembers the way through the dark. So if you feel it rising in you, don't be afraid. If your skin itches with the pull of something ancient, don't turn away. If the world feels too small for your becoming, open the door. And if you find yourself at the edge of the woods, step in, not as a stranger, but as one who knows. The story is already inside you. The moon is already listening. And somewhere, just beyond the trees, the next voice is waiting to tell it again.